Hello there, everyone. I'm Geraldine Begg. I'm the Technology Enabled Care in Housing Programme Coordinator here at SFHA. I'm really delighted to invite Sam along today. Sam is a PhD researcher at the University of Bristol, and he's also the Ethics and Sustainability Lead at HomeLink, which is part of ACO. So he's worked with HomeLink since January 2020. And his current research, Connected and Fair, is funded by the Economic and Research Council's Business Collaboration Fund. So the project has engaged more than 500 social housing residents. I think Sam said to me it was about 10% who were from Scotland. And it's also engaged with social landlords and other sector stakeholders to understand how users engage with and their expectation of the Internet of Things. So Sam's work strongly links in with our Tech and Housing Healthier Homes initiative, which I know a lot of you are involved with. That's exploring with providers and tenants the relationship between home, heat and health, and how digital technologies might help. So before I hand over to Sam, just a couple of little bits about the order of the session and the housekeeping arrangements as well. So Sam's presentation will last for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to run a couple of polls just to get a little bit of insight about where you are with Internet of Things. And then we're going to move on to a question and answer session. So will you please see down at the bottom of the taskbar, you'll see your Q&A button. So any thoughts that come to your head as you're watching the presentation, please just put them in the question and answer, put them in the Q&A part there, and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. So please don't feel like you have to wait. And for any of you who aren't used to our sessions, if you're joining for our first time, then it's probably useful for you to know that there will be a link that will bring you to the recording of the session, and it'll be hosted in the same place. So you'll be able to rewatch it. If anybody's having any technical issues at all, please just pop up your hand. Molly is here, helping to keep everything running beautifully smoothly and arranging all of the session for us today. So she'll be able to assist if you need. Otherwise, you can put something in the chat function and she'll pick it up there. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you enjoy the session, and I'm going to hand over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you for having me along this afternoon, and thank you everyone for attending as well. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So as Geraldine has mentioned, I'm the Ethics and Sustainability Lead at HomeLink, and I've been working on some research into the ethics of IoT for social housing. I think it's a really important topic to discuss at the early stage of implementing IoT, and it's something where we haven't really done much work up until this point. So kind of the purpose of the research is to get that conversation moving and give kind of people who are practitioners in the sector and also social residents an idea of the kind of issues that are emerging in IoT. So I'll just give you a quick overview of IoT for social housing to start with, and then move on to some of the considerations for ethical IoT. We'll then have a look at some of the research, some of the details about the research projects that we've conducted, and then move on to some of the outputs from that research, including some ethical principles, which make up a framework to kind of guide practice in the sector. And then looking at some key recommendations out of that research. So the Internet of Things is the network of connected devices that's linked together by the internet, including sensors, alarms, other wearables, smartphones, smart speakers, and all other smart devices that you have in your homes. We can combine this with artificial intelligence to use the data that these devices collect to make better informed decisions about our homes. So in social homes, why would we do this? Well, it can help us learn more about the homes, keeping them safe and habitable for our residents. We can use it for fire safety, looking at health impacts like respiratory issues caused by poor quality housing, and also to looking at overcoming fuel poverty, improving energy efficiency of buildings, and therefore being able to reduce the fuel bills of those who are in need. We can also use it to reduce and eradicate some preventable issues and kind of catch them at an early stage. Issues caused by things like, sorry, one sec. Just skipped ahead. Issues like condensation, damp and mold, and as I said, that other things kind of stemming from poor quality housing. Just to delve a little bit deeper into those benefits of IoT, we can use it for proactive maintenance. So as I mentioned, we can use it to identify problems before they become costly and start to cause other issues beyond them themselves, impacting the residents and also increasing the costs for us in terms of resolving them. It allows us full remote visibility and allows us to look at compliance within the properties. So is everything as it should be? We can use the data to inform our decision making, to improve asset management processes, and also use it to kind of have a better digital trail of different events that happen in homes. So an example might be the fire alarms sounding, alarming, or removal of the heads. So we have a good log of those events. Sorry, I don't know why it's skipping ahead. We also can use it for real-time notification. So those risks that might arise, we can be warned of them at an earlier stage to kind of take action at an earlier point. So in terms of implementing IoT in the right way, we think ethics needs to be embedded in that at an early stage. There's been quite a lot of work recently around digital ethics more broadly, and Professor Luciano Floridi says that ethics is what comes before the rules, during the rules, and after the rules. So it kind of frames the whole debate. So using an ethical approach enables us to minimize the risk of adverse impacts. As landlords and technology suppliers, we are the ones kind of introducing the technologies into people's lives. So we have a responsibility to ensure that they are not adversely impacting people. Using an ethical approach enables us to address concerns across different contexts. Ethics isn't a one-size-fits-all. Sorry, this is frustrating. Isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of pursuit, and we need to think about how different contexts might affect, might bring out different risks, different issues that need to be kind of considered more broadly. An ethical approach enables us to think about the impacts of technological innovation, which is often really rapid. We introduce technologies into people's lives, and we don't really know how they might impact them. But if we think about rights and wrongs and how those technologies might adversely impact people, as well as the benefits they provide, we can kind of deal with them at source, those issues. And similarly, legislation is often lagging behind technology. We need to think about, a technology innovation doesn't come coupled with legislation to kind of accompany it. So we need to think about how we can kind of deal with that disconnect between the speed of those two things. And then finally, if we take an ethical approach, we can look at the wider acceptance of IoT, and acceptability is a key aspect in terms of providing successful IoT programs. So looking at ethics a little bit more closely and giving you an overview of what ethics really is. It's a system of moral principles that guide individuals or groups. So we all have a system of ethics, and every day it guides our lives and the decisions of groups. It asks questions about what is right and wrong, and this will be different for those different groups and individuals. It looks at rights and responsibilities, and as I said, it informs decision making. So our system of ethics is kind of embedded within the decisions we make. And our ethics is influenced by several different factors, and this isn't an exhaustive list, just some ideas, but our personal characteristics and upbringing affect our ethics. The social norms of the society that we grow up in and live in, and the culture or the religion that can impact what ethics means to us. Different other contextual factors, so for example, geography or politics. I use the example of China versus the UK and how ethics might differ in those two countries. Legal considerations, so the law and regulation can kind of frame what's acceptable. And beyond that, we can kind of think, well, what's that missing? So ethics can be influenced by that kind of more structured framing of the issues. And then finally, time is one that kind of gets overlooked now and then, but if you think about what was ethical 20 or 30 years ago, it's probably very different to nowadays. In terms of looking at social housing and looking at legislation that might affect us, we've got things like GDPR, Social Housing White Paper, the Homes Act, other strategic priorities, broader regulation, and although we don't have it yet, standards potentially for IoT. Ethics basically is everything, including those and around it. So we just need to think about those broader concerns across those areas there. And this kind of gives a nice picture of how like legal considerations can frame the ethical debate as well. So how do we basically act ethically? There's a nice framework from bioethics, which is really quite is applicable in quite a lot of situations. And there's 5 principles. So the first one is beneficence. So we need to ask, how can we do good? Is what we're doing good? Second is non-maleficence. So how do we avoid those adverse impacts and reduce the risk of them? Autonomy. How do we preserve human agency, and is what we're doing kind of benefiting the individual that's affected by it? Justice. How do we ensure fairness and equity? So are people being disadvantaged, or some groups advantaged where others are missing out? And then in terms of particularly with technology and places, things that are slightly more complex where people might not have the knowledge, is what explainability. So is what we're doing understandable? Can we show people how we're taking some inputs and producing outputs from them and how we're doing it? Just give you a quick some examples, some quick examples from our research of resident perspectives on the technologies. So these are all direct quotes from residents. So concerns around disreputable landlords abusing tenants via technology, for example, keeping the heating too low, using stats to disguise disrepair, blaming tenants for damp caused by disrepair. Most people are fully capable of adjusting their heating, etc. as required. This technology is fine for incompetent people who should be looked after in care homes. Quite a kind of strong view there, but it kind of shows that people are probably not aware of what the technology can do for them. Concerns about what technology might be doing to our health, understanding kind of how it impacts our health. The environmental impact of adding more technology into our homes and using more energy potentially, although it can have the other effect of reducing energy consumption. And then concerns around landlord agenda and how much the tenant has a say in what's happening in social homes. So how can we as organisations working in the social housing sector contribute to providing a more ethical approach? Well, there's 2 ways that we've kind of conceptualised in the research. So the first is governance ethics, and the second is technology ethics. So dealing with issues within those 2 areas. Governance ethics includes looking at decision-making processes, who's involved, how those processes work, enhancing transparency, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. fostering a kind of sense of trust. Trust is seen as a key factor in terms of influencing resident acceptance of technology. So if we can work to find ways to enhance trust, that would be beneficial. We need to clearly define the purpose of data collection and only use data for that purpose. We can bring in robust feedback and auditing mechanisms to ensure that what we're doing is kind of kept within our parameters of what is ethical. We can develop codes of practice, and we can also provide information to residents to provide them with kind of a clear understanding of what we're doing and why. And so in terms of technology, we can look at the embedded bias within the technology itself. So IoT and the kind of insights we get from it is driven by software, and that software has to be written by someone. So there will be biases included that kind of accompany that software. We need to ensure the data quality and other characteristics like who we share the data with, who owns it, that we have kind of reasoning for those that adheres to ethical principles. We need to ensure the technology is fit for purpose and the outputs that it provides are kind of useful, both for kind of organizations in the sector, but also residents. Technologies need to be usable. So those people who are affected by them need to be able to use them effectively and get the best out of them so that they can realize the benefits. And then finally, we need to work to ensure that the technology empowers people, that it makes their lives better, and not use it, kind of more sinister means to have power over people, which can quite often be the concern with IoT. Things like surveillance and that kind of thing pop up quite often. So the Connected and Fair research, as Geraldine mentioned, we spoke with over 500 social residents and 50 industry actors, asked them a series of questions. So social residents were asked about their demographics, their relationship with their landlord, including ideas of trust, what their home was like, and how useful they would find different IoT technologies and how comfortable they would be with them. Industry actors were asked about their organization, their role within that organization, and what they perceived to be the purpose of IoT for them. And then both groups were asked about benefits, risks, and priorities for IoT and how familiar they were with different technologies, just to kind of get an idea of who they were and the kind of background knowledge they had. Some benefits of the connected home. This is split into organizations and residents. So both groups perceive that IoT would bring them greater convenience in their lives, and things like improvements for resident safety and health. So kind of those broader social benefits. Things like compliance and financial savings for landlords were a lot lower on the residents' list of kind of benefits, which may be kind of expected, but still some were perceptive that they were there. If you look down the whole list as well, so each of the benefits, organizations, people working in organizations in the sector tended to be a bit more kind of optimistic about the benefits of connected homes. Each one they're higher on. And if you look at the bottom, even some residents suggest that there were no benefits from IoT. So you will have that group that kind of push back against it. If we look at risks, the picture's kind of inverted. So residents are kind of maybe a bit more pessimistic or concerned about the risks of IoT. But even beyond that, if we look, they're kind of very similar in terms of how they rate those risks. So issues with data privacy and data sharing right at the top for both groups, as well as cost. Concerns about the benefits not being realized because of a lack of trust. So there's that trust issue again, both in the technology itself, but also within those organizations. And then a small number of both groups didn't kind of perceive there to be any risks or drawbacks. I'll just give you an idea of resident acceptance, so the kind of factors that affect it. We conceived resident acceptance as a combination of how useful they perceive the technologies to be, and also how comfortable they would be with having those technologies in their home. We gave them this list of technologies to kind of rate on these two scales. So I guess the picture here is that those technologies that maybe they are the kind of life safety or quality of their home, those kind of issues, were higher in terms of their usefulness. And then those which they may be less familiar with, so looking at indoor air quality and humidity, they found to be less useful. Having said that, we still get quite a high number of residents suggesting that they can see the use in all of these different technologies. And then if we move on to how comfortable they would be with the technologies, you can see it's quite a high number of people extremely comfortable, like over 50% with most of the technologies. They're extremely comfortable, and almost 75% were kind of somewhat comfortable with most of the technologies. There will still be skeptical groups, and that's absolutely expected. I think an interesting one is the smart meter and how comfortable they would be with those technologies. That's probably one on the list where they are more likely to have already had experience with that. So it will be interesting as we move forward to see how that picture changes. We also tested some different kind of factors in terms of what affects resident acceptance. And these were the significant factors that came out of the research. So those who perceived IoT to enhance convenience in their lives were more likely to be accepting of it. Similarly, those who perceived IoT to be compatible with their existing lifestyle, or if it was compatible with their existing lifestyle, they were likely to be more accepting. Those who were more risk averse were less likely to be accepting of the technologies. Those who perceived IoT to be, those who perceived IoT to be easy to use were more likely to be accepting. Those, again, who had trust in governance actors, technology companies, and social housing organizations, they were more likely to be accepting. Those who perceive the technologies to give them greater autonomy were also likely to be more accepting. Females tended to be more accepting of the technologies. And then finally, older age groups, so those over 65, were less likely to be accepting of the technology. So these are just some areas where we can look at either making changes or thinking about how we would implement technologies in certain situations. So our ethical framework that comes out of the research and out of our findings is based on a global overview of kind of AI ethics that's happened recently. It was conducted at Harvard, and we kind of mapped the key concerns from our research onto the principles that came out of that research. So we've got 8 principles, and these are them. So resident privacy, fairness, equity, and non-discrimination, improving human welfare, avoiding the misuse of data, public awareness and knowledge, cybersecurity, transparency and explainability, and autonomy. And I'll go through just quickly each of those in turn now and give you an idea about what we're talking about when we think about those things. So to start with resident privacy. So we're looking at how we can do things in data collection, storage, and consent to ensure that privacy is maintained. We need to think about how we can protect personal information while still providing really good benefits from the technology. We need to think about how decision-making processes in social housing obscure the situation in terms of whose data it is. Is the data owned by the person or the group who own the property, or is that data, which is influenced by how the person lives in that home, is it their data? So we need to think about that. And if we think about that in the context of the Human Rights Act, Article 8 says that everyone has the right to respect for their private and family life, their home, and their correspondence. So if we're thinking about people's homes here, should the data be theirs, or and should they be involved in the decision-making processes that come with it? Fairness, equity, and non-discrimination. So there are risks that we reinforce existing social inequality, both if we exclude or misuse technology once we've installed it. So we need to think carefully about that. We need to think about how we can ensure fair access and opportunity. Those who might not be to the more digitally minded end of the spectrum, how do we ensure that they can also receive the benefits from IoT? And how do we ensure those who choose to participate are not disadvantaged by their choice? They're not. We empower them rather than having power over them and doing things with their data that we shouldn't be doing. And then we need to take steps to address technical bias within algorithms that would kind of serve to reinforce some of those issues that we just mentioned there. Improving human welfare. So we're installing and we're introducing technology into people's lives, ultimately to improve their lives. So we need to ensure that it does that. We need to think about the broad scale benefits, and there might be circumstances where broad scale benefits are huge, but individual circumstances mean that people are adversely affected. So it's the kind of situation where we need to ensure that everyone is benefiting rather than, most people. We need to understand that IoT and AI should be used as tools for decision making rather than using them to make those decisions for us. We need to acknowledge that there's difficulties with programming different concepts like compassion, empathy, fairness, these kind of human concepts, and that links back to using the technology as a tool rather than replacing humans in the process. And we need to think about sustainability, using technology in a way that doesn't reduce the capacity of future generations to meet their needs. To avoid the misuse of data, we need to look at clearly articulating the purpose of collecting data and use it only for that purpose. Trust is a key factor in ensuring that the data is used in a way that it's kind of been laid out that it will be used for. And residents will also be more engaged in the process if they trust their landlords, and if we enable them to be engaged in that process. We need to implement robust data management and use processes, and also minimize the risk of malpractice. And there's things we can do like data anonymization and data aggregation to make that data less usable for other people. Public awareness and knowledge is an important factor. So currently there's a lack of public knowledge in terms of digital technologies, and some of the broader digital ethics work kind of suggests that this is something that needs to be really kind of improved on. There's a difference in the knowledge levels between and within groups, and this can lead to people being disadvantaged or excluded from certain things. So we need to think about how we can overcome that, providing technologies that kind of cater for a broad spectrum of people. We need to provide information about how data is generated, how it's collected, what we do to analyze it, how it's used, inform them about ownership of that data and who should have ownership of it. And also kind of security and cybersecurity mechanisms. And ultimately, the aim of this kind of improvement of digital literacy would be to help people make those better informed judgments and to help them act more responsibly in the digital space and with digital technologies. That links quite nicely to cybersecurity. So as with our kind of offline selves, our online selves also need to be confident in the spaces that we inhabit online. And those spaces are increasing in terms of how they are, how they work, what they do, and digital technologies are doing this. And in a situation like this where residents, users might not necessarily have full control over the technologies. We need to ensure that there's robust cybersecurity in place. And the final two, so transparency and explainability. I've mentioned transparency a few times, but we need to ensure that kind of intention and purpose are clearly communicated, and that can help to build trust. And providing clear information that lays out what we're doing is another key factor in that. Explainability refers to the extent to which we can understand how a system produces a certain output, so how the inputs are used to create an output. And in doing this, it gives us different sections of that process that we can kind of map and understand how different things like policy and regulation and ethics can be used to change those different components. And then finally, autonomy. Technology can be used to both enable and enhance autonomy. And this is what we need to be fostering. We need to be autonomy of residents needs to be a key factor in this. We need to use, as I've mentioned before, we need to use technology to empower people rather than having power over them. And then we need to think about data ownership again. Who owns that data? Who decides what's done with it? So from kind of how we can contribute to the ethical debate, or ethical IoT, and also looking at those ethical principles. The research came up with 10 recommendations, 5 governance ethics recommendations and 5 on the technology side of things. And this is kind of just a starting point to get you thinking about what you might be able to do straight away in terms of implementing ethics in your IoT. So firstly, find ways to involve those most affected in decision making. Work collaboratively, so with technology companies, with other social landlords, with other organizations in the social housing space. There's no one person or group who will say what is ethical, and they can't define what is ethical. So these issues will arise in different areas, and only by working collaboratively can we have this kind of broad coverage. We need to ensure we've got mechanisms for accountability. So for when if things do go wrong, that we have processes in place to deal with them prior to implementing the technologies. Again, building trust and using transparency to do that is really key. And there's no sooner place where we can start doing that. And then actively contribute to that idea of public digital literacy and educating your residents a bit more in terms of what the technologies do and how they do them, do what they do. Technology, looking at how we can implement ethics into that. So find ways of raising awareness of bias in people and algorithms. Stories are coming out, quite regularly about how a bias is embedded within technologies and big tech companies, and more of this will come out as we move forward. Need to make sure that we are using appropriate data for insights. Make sure that we're building systems that cater to a resident knowledge baseline, thinking about including those who might be either digitally excluded or less able to participate. Again, using data to empower, not to have power over, so finding ways to do that. And then finally, being really clear and transparent on the purpose of the data that we're collecting and its ownership. So just quickly summarize and tell you about what we're doing next, just briefly. So the research has kind of concluded that we need to operate ethically in the connected home sector, particularly given the lack of regulation at this point. It needs to. This is a great opportunity to start doing this at an early stage rather than thinking about things after the fact. Working collaboratively and actively promoting ethical approaches, engaging in the conversation can really help that and allow us to think about these broader ethical issues that might not necessarily have already come up for us, but others will have experienced them. We've got the two core approaches to addressing ethical issues, either from a governance perspective or a technology perspective. We should enable everyone who's affected to have a say and be facilitators of that discussion and find ways to, new ways to do it. And it's really not up to one person, body or organization to decide what is ethical IoT in social homes. Different situations will have these different ethical issues and also solutions to those ethical issues. And so this is a discussion for as many people as who want to be involved to have. And on that note, we really want to put together a working group for ethical IoT in social housing. I think it was really important to start work on this now, whilst it's likely that the government will bring in guidelines and regulations in the future. It would be great to have kind of like a sector-wide framework to understand how we can do this ethically at this stage, so that those issues that might arise at a later stage are already kind of dealt with, and we have mechanisms in place to deal with them. So thank you for your time today. The research project, the final report is available. You can download it from aco.co.uk/IoT. And if anyone has any more questions, or they'd like to get involved in the working group, or if you just have any other kind of questions or want to get in touch with me, my email address is there. So please feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was great. You covered a lot of ground there. So there's already some questions coming in, but what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, Molly, are you good to launch the polls and we can just see where, get a little bit of a sense check in with people? Oh, thanks very much. So if folk don't mind, just pop in your answers. There's just 3 very quick little questions, just so that we can see where we are. So are you already using IoT as part of your housing services? Okay, so we've got a few early adopters in here, Sam. So we've got 3 of the organizations represented who are doing something. So about 25% are already doing something with IoT. Thanks, Molly. Can we do the next one? So I suppose this is targeted probably mainly at those 3, but of the rest of you, maybe some of you are already, maybe haven't implemented something, but are doing something. So just to find out if there's been any consideration yet from anybody. And it is very early days for all of our IoT stuff up here. So we'll just give another moment. Well, isn't that reassuring, Sam? So 89% have already been considering the ethics. So yeah, that's really heartening to see that. And the last question, Molly? Okay, so would you be comfortable having IoT installed in your home by someone other than yourself? Whatever that IoT may be. Now, how interesting is that? So I guess that really tells us why we need to be doing things in partnership with our tenants. We need to be asking ourselves all of these questions as we're moving forward. Yeah, very good. Thank you very much for answering that. Sam, any observations there from you before I move on to some of the questions?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, that one's really interesting, that final one. In the research, there was, we asked some broader questions, which we'll probably share at some point on social media. But we asked, we asked the same questions to residents and landlords, and the kind of breadth of answers that we got back in terms of how much people agreed with certain things or didn't agree with them. So a good example would be they were asked whether they would be accepting of certain technologies being installed in their homes without their kind of consent at all. Whether there were some technologies that existed that would be kind of acceptable to be installed in their homes without consent. And social organisations from social housing, there's quite a lot of people who said yes. And what we assume from that is kind of the kind of life safety type technologies, whereas social residents were very kind of pessimistic about the fact that should be a thing. They were very much against the idea that technologies can be installed in their homes without their consent. And examples of these come up throughout these discussions. We have these questions where there's differing opinions between groups, within groups, and this is basically why we need this work to be done, and more kind of discussion in these areas, because we have these kind of clashes and tensions between different groups, understand like how they understand things, and even here, completely split down the middle. Technologies installed in people's homes by someone else, I think, again, it's just another example of one of those kind of clashes where we don't really know what's the right thing to do, and this is why we need these discussions more and more.
And just on that subject, there's been a question in relation to tenancy agreements and building this into, the consent for IoT into the agreement. Yeah. Has that come up in any of your discussions? Yeah,
so we have had discussions around building consent into tenancy agreements. Some of the issues that we've thought about in terms of, the rights to have somewhere to live, and should having IoT and accepting that those technologies are in your homes be a condition of signing that agreement. It's a very kind of contentious area that I think we need to be careful about. Then ultimately there needs to be some sort of opt-out mechanism. So having that consent separate to the tenancy agreement is probably advisable, certainly at this stage when we don't know how things might play out. When things become a bit more mature, then it might be different mechanisms to do that. But consent is one thing that we're working on with a law firm at the moment in terms of how we can, different legal bases for installing technologies in people's homes, and whether we need to use the technologies to do that job or whether there's other ways of doing it. I think the condition of the indoor living conditions of people's homes, technologies are really effective in terms of identifying issues. So there might be other legal kind of avenues for installing those technologies, like public task under GDPR. Again, we need to decide whether that's right, whether that's, because the law says it, do we want to do it? And what are the issues around that? So yeah, it's a tricky area, and it's something that I think as a sector probably need to decide, rather than doing it by individual landlords or however the process works.
Thanks, Sam. So somebody's also asked, it was mentioned that there's currently no IoT standards. Are there plans for these to be introduced?
So no, there aren't any IoT standards for smart home technology, really, there's certain technology standards, but there aren't standards for IoT itself. There are discussions going on, as it were, and I think they will be implemented in not in the not too distant future. But I think the purpose of having this kind of ethical approach enables us to do this work before having those standards in place to guide it. Arguably, we could wait, but we don't know how long that will be. And actually, in doing this work, I think it would actually go quite a long way to contributing to those standards themselves, understanding what best practice looks like. And I think it's something that we shouldn't shy away from. I think the kind of ethical issues are something that we don't like to touch just generally in society. Like it can be something that's a bit contentious, so we're not going to think about it too much. We'll just go with what the legislation says, and that's fine. But especially where that legislation or the standards don't exist, then we need to think more carefully about things.
Thank you. There's a question here from Robert. So does the last question reflect the difference between tenants and homeowners? So I'm wondering if that will be relating probably to the last question in the poll that we just did about who's willing to have the IoT installed by somebody else in their home.
Yeah, potentially. I think that's another really, it's a good observation, and people have different relationships with their home, based on many different factors. But I think, tenancy is one of them. Just how we are, just our general disposition in terms of how we live at home, or whether we are, out a lot and you use home as somewhere where we just sleep and eat. People have different conceptions of what home is. So they're going to influence how accepting we are of someone coming in and installing something else in our home that we're not quite sure about. So yeah, that's probably a factor, and there'll be lots of other things as well. Yeah,
and I suppose in our Healthier Homes thing, we're including homeowners as well as tenants, because we're interested to see where those variations come. So Graham was just saying that he's read your full report. I've put the link, and we have it up on the screen. I've put a link in there as well. And he was just saying, yep, really great work, very comprehensive. And I know that I've certainly said that to you as well. It's a great, foundation for us now to be thinking on and working from. So somebody has then moved on to say, do we need a sector-wide ethics standard? So I know that's something that we're working towards, and we're working with, having those conversations with you. But Sam, what do you reckon? We need a sector-wide ethics standard for the housing sector?
Sorry, in the housing sector, yeah. I don't really see the harm in it. I mean, obviously, different areas will have different ethical issues, so it needs to be broad enough to think about all those concerns, and we certainly don't want to be leaving holes in that ethical standard. So provision needs to be made for those areas where we might not have thought about issues. There's ethical concerns that come out, and I think the kind of big tech examples are the ones that shock people the most. They're things that, for example, different bias. So I think Apple, for example, when they brought out their credit cards, they were like really keen to remove that bias from their decision-making processes. So they didn't use a person's sex to try and eradicate that kind of gender discrimination. But when it came down to it, they kind of assessed who had got the largest credit limits, and a significant proportion of men had larger limits than women. And it wasn't the fact that we have this they've removed the sex variable from it, but there's so many other things that feed into those and relate to those variables. So there's these kind of unintended consequences that we don't realize. So that sector-wide framework or standard needs to have provision to ensure that those things don't get missed. And
Yeah,
I think it will be a
absolutely.
constantly evolving thing. As I said, time can be an influence on ethics. So what is ethical will continue to evolve. So it's not something that will be set in stone, 2022, this is the standard and it sticks around for 5 years. It's something that needs to be kind of a living and growing thing.
Yeah, and in terms of the algorithms and stuff like that, I suppose I'm seeing in my head parallels between the move from analog to digital telecare and equipment,
Yeah.
and thinking, about approved suppliers lists and stuff. Somebody, when you can feel assured, if you're somebody out procuring new IoT systems, how do you know that
Yeah.
these biases aren't already built in? How do you have that certainty? And I suppose there's that thing about, in terms of standards, where are the ones that we can control as housing providers and our policies and our practices and everything. But then if there's no standard there for actual technology producers, then that makes it all a little bit tricky for us.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
suppose there's a document in Scotland called Digital Nation, Changing Digital Nation. I'll pop a wee link in there. And I know that there's some work aiming towards that kind of stuff up here. So, but it's all very, very early days.
Yeah, great. I think it's you could probably make a parallel with environmental impact, sustainability, that kind of thing. That's coming more into the procurement process. And standards have emerged there in terms of kind of, carbon impact and that kind of thing. And as you say, I think to be assured of that kind of ethical approach and where you've sourced technology from, or as you say, what's embedded within those algorithms, like what steps have been taken to ensure that those things are kind of been resolved ethically. There needs to be something more robust that we can rely on.
So Sam, here's another question. Do you think the smart meter rollout has been a help in familiarizing people with IoT technology, or maybe more of a hindrance if there's been resistance or negative experiences? Has the link been made?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. I think there's been a lot of negative press around smart meters. And I don't think the kind of wider infrastructure or systems were in place to get the best out of them. So they've probably got a little bit of a historical bad rap that moving forward, I think, they are, in terms of looking at energy usage and reducing that, I think they're a really useful tool to have in terms of the data that we can draw from them. I do think the way in which it's been rolled out has negatively impacted people's perspectives of them. And I guess that, this work goes some way to kind of dealing with some of those issues and thinking about what could go wrong. How do we do it so that, people don't get those kind of early bad impressions because we haven't thought about what could go wrong. That kind of, I think, yeah. And I also think smart meters they're not imposed on people, but because it was a national rollout, it was on such scale that we didn't have the kind of capacity to deal with those kind of negative opinions at an early stage. I think if we can do it on a smaller scale and learn what might emerge and how people's perspectives change with use, and how we can improve people's perspectives of different technologies, then I think that's probably a more effective way of doing it.
So there's a question, how can we build on the research that you conducted? So I've already said, I think maybe it was off camera here, that, through Healthier Homes, I can see a great use for some of those conversation starters, and also the, to build on this a bit further, because, the work that's happening there. But what else are you thinking, Sam? Because we'll link up with this work together.
Yeah, I guess so. So as I said, the intention was to kind of get more of a conversation going and to give it a kind of primer to people about what the ethical issues might be. So I think a good place to start is just to look at the recommendations at the end and see if that's something you can start implementing within your organization and engaging residents. Looking at the ethical framework and seeing, you know, what you think of it, and sharing it with others who might not have seen it. Looking at gaps, I think we need to just, you know, this is kind of a first attempt, and I wonder if, you know, there probably are things that I've missed, and, you know, so having that kind of broader discussion, setting up events like this where we're just actually going to have a discussion about this, like they're solely focused on the ethics that up until this point have kind of been excluded from that conversation, is a really good thing to do. And then I think moving forward, as I mentioned at the end, we really want to set up some sort of working group, some sort of forum, something where we can work to put together potentially some ethical standards, or kind of look to cement this, or make this ethical framework more concrete, to guide practice at the moment prior to any legislation coming in. And also, as I said again, like the kind of best practice angle where we can look at how what's going on now can influence and what needs to be embedded within that legislation. I think, you know, there's lots of opportunity there for this group to move forward.
And Sam, it's focused in on the sensors and, you know, on the environmental part at the minute. So within social housing, you know, we've got quite a lot of experience now of people using motion sensors, falls, you know, falls algorithms to try and support people to stay well, you know, within the specialist housing.
Yeah.
So all of those ways that it can be used for independent living. So there's a whole host of various different things. Are you thinking to be widening out the ethical debate and the research that you're doing to include all the different aspects of housing, or is it more just those ones that are aligned to the kind of eco HomeLink kind of products?
No, absolutely. I think we need to look at those broader use cases. I think there'll be more niche, I guess, those kind of use cases. So they'll have their own set of ethical issues. I think when we come to looking at maybe motion detectors, for example, we need to think about, you know, what might that data otherwise be used for in terms of people being in, and you know, there's kind of a surveillance aspect concern there, where people might think, you know, who's seeing this data, who can tell what I'm doing and where I'm moving in my home. So then, yeah, I think yes, this absolutely needs to be some work on those kind of wider use cases.
Great, because even with the CO2 monitors, we need to be very clear with people that we would be able to get the insights as to their movement, because they're so sensitive. Listen, Sam, thank you so much for your time. Thanks everybody for coming along today. That's us just wrapping up now. As you know, the presentations, the recording of this will be available on SFHA Live following the session in the next few days. Molly will get all of that organised. I'm not sure, Molly, if we're putting on a little evaluation poll on the website or not, or sending something out, because it just helps us to plan for future sessions. So thank you everybody for coming along. Sam, thank you so much. I'm sure we all got an awful lot from that, and I'm sure folk will go and download the report and start poring over it. Oh, there's the evaluation up on the screen now. So that will give you a quick opportunity just in the closing minute to do it. It's one of those things, isn't it? If you don't do it there and then, often it doesn't get done. So I'll give you just a moment there just to complete that before we sign off.